No series on Capablanca would be complete without looking at one of his classic rook and pawn endgames, so that's what I'm going to do now. This game was played in Moscow 1936. That was a great year for Capablanca. He had a real renaissance. He won this tournament in Moscow, very strong, playing against some of the emerging Soviet players, including Botvinnik. And then he came equal first in Nottingham, one of the strongest tournaments all time. He came equal first with Botvinnik, and he faced Alyakin, Fleur, Fine, Reshevsky, Oiver, Bogolyubov, Lasker. So he seemed to really be coming into form. Anyway, this game was played in Moscow. His opponent was Ilya Khan, Soviet player. Capablanca has black. Now, a glance at this position, you might think that white has some advantage here. He has nice pawn chain, giving white some space advantage. White at the moment has two bishops, but it's the fact that black has this very nice clump of pawns that gives him perhaps some latent advantage, some kind of superiority in the centre. Probably the best move for white is, if he wants to simplify, is to play rook d4, which virtually forces an exchange of rooks. And this position should be a draw, although a knight can float around and be a little bit pesky. But instead, white felt the priority was to exchange the minor pieces off the board. And I think this shows that many of his opponents, Capablanca's opponents, simply didn't have the same quality of judgment of position that Capablanca had. Capablanca appreciates that he certainly has some advantage here, or potential to play for a win with this beautiful clump of centre pawns. So let's see how this works in practice. So b5, first advance of the pawns, and c5. You can see that pawn chain remains intact. And now the kings come into the middle of the board. So far so good. And king d2, white is waiting for the moment. Here Kasparov thinks that black should play directly for an advance through the middle with rook d8 supporting the d-pawn, and then c6 and perhaps c4 and d5. That's possible, but perhaps such a direct strategy is not Capablanca's style. First of all, rook b8. He's just toying with the idea of b4, but this is really just waiting and seeing what the options are first. And then he plays g5. So starting at this classic minority attack with these two pawns on the king's side, and this is very much Capablanca's style. He doesn't like to break immediately. He wants to take complete control of the board. h5. So he's setting up this break with g4. So rook h1, that sort of neutralizes g4 for the time being, but Kappa is happy to wait and just set things up with rook g8. It might come a little later. And he still has the option perhaps to play c6, c4 and d5, depending on how white plays. But this is really Kappa's style, wants to just make white sweat for the time being. So the rook moves away from the h-file. Clearly Khan was concerned that c6 might come. So you can see that already Kappa's idea and his strategy has paid off, because white doesn't know exactly what's coming. Perhaps g4, perhaps c6 and d5. And Kappa breaks with g4 on the king side. Here Kasparov thinks that rook h1 is a stronger move, and that certainly looks sensible to gain some counterplay with the rook against the king. Although it is very risky for white to allow black's rook to come to the second rank. This is the thing as the defender, you never know quite what to allow. This does look very dangerous to have the king pinned back on the first rank, particularly when a move like b4 comes. If that's taken, then rook a1 is mate. I mean, white can defend here. The king comes around to c6. And this king can perhaps shuffle across. I mean, black can take here and isolate a pawn, but obviously with reduced material, that increases white's drawing chances. But, as I said, a very typical situation that white simply doesn't know how to defend, what to allow, what to concede to the opponent. So Capablanca takes the open h-file, and now things are looking very serious for white. If this pawn is taken, this has fatal consequences. The pawns are now split. The rook checks and comes into f4, and e-pawn drops, and that would be the end for white. So white has to wait for the time being. And the rook comes in, so the pressure increases on white's pawns on both sides of the board. And don't forget that black still has this option to perhaps advance on through the middle. So rook d4 threatening to take and take here, so no time for white to take on b5. But now the pawn protects. And here, this was move 40. I'm guessing this was the time control. And here both sides make mistakes on this final move. Here, white waited. Again, typical. You don't want to make a committal decision when you're running short of time. In fact, if he'd had more time to calculate, he might have taken on g4, which, remember, this was would have been a terrible mistake earlier. In this case, probably the best move. If, for example, king f6 to come around to take this pawn, white has king f2. I suspect it was this move that white didn't see. The point is that here this rook is able to swing across. This rook, which was really doing nothing on the queen side, suddenly emerges into daylight and finds counterplay by hassling the king and also switching to c8 to attack this pawn, and white has enough to draw that position. Instead, white waited, and here rook h1 would have been stronger than the game continuation. In this case, if white were to take on g4, then rook f1 prevents the king coming back, and then the rook can come to f4. Let me just show you one very nice continuation here. I was wondering what might happen if the rook activated. In fact, that position was almost Zugzwang. First I was thinking, this looks like serious counterplay. But actually the king comes up the board. You can give the pawn on d6, and now rook e2 is a wonderful move, and there's no sensible defense to e4 checkmate. White's king finds itself in a mating net. But instead of rook h1, Capablanca played g3. Looks pretty good. In fact, White's move was now sealed. White sealed the wrong move, so there was an adjournment. Capablanca actually informed his opponent through the arbiter that if his opponent had sealed f4, then he would have agreed a draw, and this does look as though this simplifies down to a drawn position. and yeah, not too much to play for. I mean, black can still play on there with an active rook, but should be a draw. Instead, white sealed the move rook d3, and now the game reverts to its, well, natural course, let's say. White is almost in Zugzwang here. Very hard to do anything, and black is simply rolling through the middle with d5 and also threatening to hassle these pawns as well. He can't wait, so he broke with f4. But now again, this move, same move, rook f1, just keeps white's pieces perfectly boxed in. White pushed on with f5. Let me just show you one very nice variation if white had traded here. It seems as though black has been held at bay for the time being, but there's a very nice simplification here. In fact, this king and pawn endgame is winning. First, you'd think, looks a bit odd. White has an outside pawn. Basically, because black has so much space here, then this is winning. Let me just show you a main line. Black powers through the middle with his pawn, and white is going to end up in Zugzwang here after d3. If king g1, the pawn goes through, and if king e1, then king takes pawn and wins. There are other variations, of course, but that's the basic idea. Instead, white played f5 check. Again, the position is basically Zugzwang, and there is no defense at all to these pawns rolling through the middle of the board. And white tried b3, but this doesn't really have any effect at all. It just weakens these pawns, and black cleaned up very nicely here. Yeah, well, let me show you the game continuation. White is completely lost here. White is hoping for some counterplay with g4 and g5, but this can be prevented very simply. d4, and now those pawns just roll through. And this is absolutely hopeless here. White resigned. Not before time. Not a perfect game from Capablanca, but still he showed that he could judge a position better than his opponent, many of his opponents. But you know, you need, I think increasingly in his career, this was later on in his career, he wasn't able to win games like this because you need incredible energy to play these long games. This is where Carlsen is absolutely brilliant, because he's often, you know, he's very, very strong and young and fit, and he's able to squeeze wins out of these in these technical positions. A lot of comparisons are made between Carlsen and Karpov and Capablanca, and they are valid. Let me just remind you of the start of this endgame, which was here. Look at the pawn structures, look at the pieces that are on the board, and let me show you this game that Carlsen played against Radjabov also in Moscow. This was played in Moscow, the Tal Memorial 2012. Radjabov against Carlsen. Carlsen with the black pieces. You'll notice exactly the same pieces on the board. And here, white has slight space advantage. Carlsen already has these nice centre pawns, and Radjabov, to my eyes, made exactly the same mistake as Khan did. He decided to try and simplify the position and exchanged off this knight, which can be bothersome, but surely one should retain the bishop pair here. But no, Radjabov repeated, in my eyes, the mistake of Khan and tried to draw this position, but I'm afraid Carlsen's technique took over, and He managed to force through those centre pawns, as did Capablanca. That was the final position. Carlsen has just played rook f4 to f1, and he'll follow up with rook e1, and those centre pawns will roll through. There we go. The only lesson from history is that people don't learn the lessons from history.